Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. To argue that it is liberal democracy which has failed the global south is to assume that there is anything liberal about those unsuccessful democracies. And that could not be further from reality. This motion is not about whether liberal democracy is the best form of governance. It is about whether liberal democracy has directly failed the global south. The burden therefore lies on the proposition to prove that liberal democracy, with all its attributes including respect of the people's mandate, rule of law, and justice, is directly responsible for the failure of nations in achieving sustained economic development. And fundamentally, it is my conviction that liberal democracy has not failed the global south. Rather, it has been deliberately stifled by local elites and foreign superpowers in achieving their strategic objectives through what can better be described as sham democracies. And it is that which is the true cause of economic stagnation. But before I begin my arguments, I'd like to extend my thanks to the President for giving me this opportunity to speak on what is a really important issue in this historic chamber. It also falls upon me to introduce the speakers on side proposition. First, you've heard from Arwa, a particularly keen fresher from St. Edmund's Hall College, placing second in the election for Secretary's Committee. Time will tell if she can balance her lofty Oxford Union ambitions with achieving a first in PPE. Speaking second on side proposition, we have the Right Honourable MP for Argyll and Bute, Mr. Brendan O'Hara. Mr. O'Hara knows all too well about failed democratic experiments. In fact, his party, the SNP, has spent years demanding referendums they refuse to accept the results of, whilst presiding over a Scotland where economic growth is as elusive as a sunny day in Glasgow. Speaking third, we have the Pakistani Minister of Planning, Development and Reforms, Mr. Ahsan Iqbal. Now, I'm not at all surprised to see Mr. Asad Iqbal speaking on that side, attacking liberal democracy. After all, Mr. Iqbal's party launched the greatest attack on liberal democracy in Pakistani history by working with the military to rig elections and form a government despite having only won 17 out of 272 seats fairly. And finally, speaking fourth on side proposition, we shall have Professor Stefan Durkin, whom we are indeed fortunate to be hearing from, with his work on development economics having shaped the global discourse on development in light of the political economy. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome this evening. My argument tonight will consist of three core tenets. Firstly, that elite internal groups within Global South countries have sought to repress liberal democracy to maintain their grip on power, leading to poor economic outcomes which cannot be blamed on liberal democracy. Secondly, that we must consider the role of foreign superpowers, such as the United States, in interfering with the functioning of democracies to achieve their strategic objectives, at the cost of both security and economic prosperity. Finally, I will prove that by balancing the interests of internal elite power groups with broader economic development goals, whilst insulating itself from external control through an independent foreign policy, nations such as India have made a remarkable level of progress in improving economic outcomes, whilst engaging in democratic consolidation that has left its state of democracy significantly better off than regional rivals. So starting with my first point, it is important to establish whether nations such as Pakistan, my country of heritage, adhere to liberal democracy's core tenets. And I shall focus on two: respect of the people's mandate and rule of law. So let's start with respect to the people's mandate. In February 2024, the military establishment in Pakistan sought to eliminate Imran Khan's party from politics, using lawfare to deprive the party of its election symbol, relied on by voters who cannot read. Despite this, the party was on track to secure a two-thirds majority, according to exit polls, following which blatant poll rigging, as evidenced by images of tampered vote count forms, transformed the incumbent government's 17 seats into 75, allowing them to form a government. The consequence of such sham elections has been a surge in political instability, with the incumbent government being viewed as illegitimate. Now, I suspect the proposition will try to argue that Imran Khan's party epitomizes exactly what is wrong with liberal democracy, that it encourages instability and protest in the global south. But I want you to remember this example, that the root of this instability is not liberal democracy, but it is a concerted effort to impede the mandate of 250 million people by a powerful elite. And Pakistan isn't unique in such an experience. You mentioned Egypt. Military dictator Sisi in Egypt, who has jailed and killed hundreds of dissenting civilians and political opposition after uprooting democracy over 10 years ago, has destroyed the Egyptian economy, despite receiving billions of dollars from allies. Moving on to rule of law, a fundamental pillar of liberal democracy, as I'm sure we can all agree. Pakistan's history is rife with political imprisonments, and indeed Mr. Ahsan Iqbal's own party has regrettably suffered the consequences of being on the wrong side of Pakistan's military establishment. But since his ouster from office in 2022, Imran Khan has faced over 200 frivolous cases, ranging from terrorism, murder, and the legitimacy of his own marriage. Over the last year, both the United Nations and Amnesty International have called for Imran Khan's release, citing the sham cases leveled against him, the complete absence of due process with the lack of a fair trial, and inhumane prison conditions. Given this, I hope that Mr. Iqbal's government will give due respect to democratic values and release Imran Khan from illegal incarceration. So what can we conclude from this case? Since 2022, Pakistan has experienced a four-fold increase in net migration, and over 13 million people have fallen below the poverty line, demonstrating that it is not liberal democracy, but the erosion of it that has contributed to the nation's economic woes. Moving on to my second point, that repeated interventions of both a political and military nature from foreign superpowers against popular leaders has compromised the ability for liberal democracies to develop. And it is on this basis that I reject the notion that liberal democracy has failed the global south. Rather, it has been deliberately obstructed from taking root. Let's continue with the example of Pakistan. In 2022, when Imran Khan visited Russia to negotiate a natural gas pipeline to provide affordable gas to the people of Pakistan, the Biden regime threatened the Pakistani government at the time with international isolation, should the military-organized vote of no confidence against Imran Khan fail. But Operation Regime Change is not a novel concept, and has repeatedly brought Pakistan and many other global south nations to the brink of default. Once again, I ask you, is this a failure of liberal democracy or a consequence of its deliberate debasement by the neo-colonialist Biden regime? No, thank you. Again, Pakistan isn't the only country. From Chile to Congo, US-backed interventions to replace popular leaders with loyal autocrats have historically undermined democracy and led to economic devastation. My final point will now consider a counterexample: India. Now, the proposition may point to the substantial shortcomings in Indian democracy, but their democracy has developed substantially beyond that of countries such as Pakistan, with the Freedom House Index giving the Indian democracy a score of 29 percentage points above that of its traditional rival. The example of India illustrates that where liberal democracy is allowed to develop, economic prosperity becomes achievable, making failure no longer a foregone conclusion. In the 2000s, India's economic liberalization reforms lifted 400 million people out of poverty. But crucially, during this period, India saw timely elections, peaceful transfers of power, and the introduction of electronic voting machines, hallmarks of a liberal democracy. Contrast this to Pakistan, where not a single prime minister has completed their term due to the unabating forces of political engineering, reducing both the authority and the legitimacy of the incumbent government to undertake structural reforms. And when it comes to India's foreign policy, it has long been characterized by strategic autonomy. Take the example I previously mentioned of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in which the Indian government purchased discounted oil to meet the growing demand of its population. This is a stark contrast to Pakistan, in which the United States facilitated a regime change operation out of sheer contempt that the sitting prime minister could possibly think of providing relief to his people. And when it comes to results, the proof is in the pudding. Pakistan's inflation in 2023 surged to over 30%, whereas in India, it was 5.6%. Now, many Western politicians and journalists lamented that India's decision was fundamentally unethical in the context of an invasion, to which I say, please, spare us, the people of the Global South, your moral lecturing, and allow us to prioritize the interests of our poverty-stricken people, just as you are happy to destabilize entire regions to serve your interests. The Global South is an incredibly reductive term if we think about it. It amalgamates a range of different cultures. So to argue that liberal democracy is responsible for the overarching failure of 2/3 of the world's population is utterly simplistic. You do not have to be of the view that liberal democracy is the best form of governance to recognize that liberal democracy has simply not been allowed to develop, and so cannot be blamed for the failures of the Global South. Finally, I want you to remember that a vote for the proposition empowers increasingly authoritarian elements in countries such as Pakistan. And it is with that that I urge you to vote side opposition. Thank you.